Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on environmental supports. We've spent the last few weeks talking about a lot of different topics related to autism spectrum disorder. We've looked at many different aspects that are affected in the development of a person who has autism. So we've talked about social development, we've talked about social thinking, we've talked about sensory processing challenges, we've talked about differences in language and communication development, we've talked about the way the brain functions differently in those with autism. Now we're going to move on in our class, and we're going to spend the next few weeks here talking about how we apply that knowledge. If we are a classroom teacher or a special ed teacher, if we're some type of therapist, if we're working with children with autism in any sort of way, how is all of that information going to affect the way we work with them? We're going to start this week by looking at some kind of general guidelines and some different strategies, classroom strategies that can be put in place to help children with autism to succeed. So when we talk about a supportive environment, what are we talking about? We're talking about a classroom that is set up for the success of all children. So that means all of your typically developing children as well as all of your atypically developing children. And those atypical developments could range from ASD to physical disabilities to mental challenges. It could be a whole host of things that are happening for the children in your classroom. When we think specifically about children with ASD, we need to know what type of environmental supports do these children need in order to be successful. Some of the things that we're going to talk about today, they need structure and a predictable routine. Excuse me. They need picture schedules and other visual supports. And those picture schedules tie right in with the predictable routine of the classroom. They need a lack of distractions. Think back to our topic of sensory processing challenges. If children are overwhelmed by sensory input, those distractions are going to be really overstimulating for them. They need verbal reminders of upcoming activities and transitions. So they need help transitioning from activity to activity, and they need a quiet place, somewhere that is safe for them in the classroom. When we talk about environmental supports or a supportive environment, it's important to realize that we're not just talking about the physical setup of the classroom. Yes, excuse me again. The physical aspect of the classroom, of the environment, is an important element of the environment that we're talking about. But there are a couple of other things we're talking about. So when we talk about environmental supports or classroom environment, we're talking about three different things. We're talking about the physical environment, so that includes things like the room layout, organization of materials within the classroom, the way the centers are set up. We're talking about things like where the exits are, safety features that are there for children who might have any sort of challenging behaviors. We're talking about modifications for disabilities. So we're talking about all aspects of the physical classroom. We're also talking about the temporal element of the classroom. So this is not something you can see, but something that dramatically affects all of the people who are a part of that classroom. So we're talking about the schedule of the classroom. We're talking about the way that transitions are handled, the way time is used in the classroom, the types of activities even that are offered. So, are children in whole group times all day long? Are they in small group times all day long? So how is time used within the classroom? And we're talking about the social element of the environment. So we're talking about the relationships that are formed and the way that positive relationships are fostered within the classroom. A couple of things to keep in mind before we talk about specific environmental supports. It's important to remember for all children that addressing the environment first is a proactive step, right? So you want to set the children in your classroom up for success. So you want to set up the environment in a way that's going to minimize problems. So this is going to help you to avoid confrontations and prevent problems in the first place. Obviously, it's not going to prevent all problems, but if you can minimize those problems, you've already taken a really positive first step. You also need to keep in mind that the supports that are put in place in your classroom or in whatever sort of environment you're in should be individualized to meet the needs of the child. You have to know the child first. And certainly when we're talking about children with ASD, because we have that huge range, right? All supports are not going to be effective for all children. In fact, no support is going to be effective for every child. You have to know the child first. You have to know the child's specific needs, the goals that the child is working towards, and you have to know that child personally as well, as an individual. So now I'm going to use these next few slides to just go over quite a few different environmental supports that you might see used for children on the autism spectrum. These aren't really listed in any particular order, but all of them are used to a varying degree with lots of different children with ASD. So the first one is teaching skills and concepts in naturally occurring situations. So we want to be sure that when we're providing children with ASD with additional instructional support, and that instruction, I don't just mean academic instruction, I mean any type of instruction, possibly regarding self-help skills or social skills, that those are occurring in naturally occurring situations as much as possible. So we don't always want the child to have to be leaving the classroom. Sometimes that's what needs to happen, depending on what's being taught or depending on the classroom setting. But we also want to have the situations that the child is naturally in during the day, and that includes at home, especially when we're talking about early intervention. And then we want to also teach across settings to maximize generalizations, right? So if we want children to be learning how to give a greeting, when someone greets them, we want to make sure that the child is being taught how to do that at home and at school and at any other important community settings where the child is typically involved. We want to provide a predictable environment with consistent daily routine and minimal transitions. Those three parts are really key for children with ASD, especially when you think about maybe children with more of that high-functioning high-functioning autism or Asperger's type of diagnosis. All children thrive on predictability, but these children in particular are incredibly disturbed when their routine is changed, especially when they don't know that a change is coming. So you want to make their environment predictable. You want them to be able to expect where to find their supplies, where to find their clothes, where to find their shoes every single day. You want this predictable environment to have a consistent daily routine. So you don't want things to be changing all the time every day as far as when they're going down for their nap, how they're going down for their nap, what the routine is to get ready for nap. You want those things to be consistent. And you want their transitions to be as minimal as possible. Transitions are challenging for all children. For children with ASD, they're especially challenging. So think about how can you minimize those transitions. One of the things that we talk a lot about for children with ASD, and this is going to be related to one of your assignments, is using picture schedules and visual supports. So children with ASD are typically stronger in their visual processing than they are in their auditory processing. So just giving children verbal reminders about what they're expected to do is not always going to be effective. So there are a couple of ways that this might happen. You might see a picture schedule being used, kind of like you see in most preschool classrooms, where it gives the order of the day, right? First we have circle time, then we have center time, then we have snack, and so on and so forth. For a child with ASD, though, what we're talking about here is a picture schedule that is designed just for that child, and that is perhaps a lot more broken down. So it doesn't just say center time. It talks specifically, it shows specifically what the child will be doing during center time, and it helps the child to understand the sequence of events and what he should be doing during that time in the classroom. A really simple example of a picture schedule is something called a first-then board, and there's a video that you can watch about this in this week's activity folder. A first-then board shows a child really specifically what he needs to do first and then what he needs to do next. And a lot of times this type of board is used to give a child some motivation, right? So first they need to do some type of necessary practice or necessary academic activity, and then they get a reward. And it can help the child to see specifically, I'm going to do this, and then this will happen. And remember that so when I say here that the first-then boards give a visual support for a complex language structure, children with ASD often have difficulty with these kinds of sentence comprehensions that involve clauses. So if you say to a typically developing child, after we read a story, we're going to play outside, it's not that difficult for the child to comprehend what you're saying, but a child with ASD has a really difficult time putting all those pieces of the story together and understanding the dependent relationship here, so that we do this and then we do that. But seeing it visually can make it really clear for the child. Other environmental supports, they can include role-playing social situations for consistent daily routines, right? So this is the way that we get ready for snack. We line up at the sink. We wash our hands. We dry our hands. We get our lunchbox. So things like that. Not only having that consistent daily routine, but allowing the child to role play that over and over, to practice it as many times as necessary. This is going to help the child to predict what's coming next and to handle transitions better. Designating a safe place and a quiet area for a child to calm down and have alone time. It's really important that you remember that this shouldn't be used for any sort of punishment or consequence. So we're not talking about a timeout area. We're really talking about just a safe place, a calm down place. It's best if this place is designated only for that child. Obviously, that can be challenging depending on your classroom setting, but even if it's just, one pillow with a stuffed animal and a couple of books that's in a corner, and that child knows that that's my safe place, and if I feel overwhelmed, I can go there and I can stay there as long as I need to. We've already talked a little bit about minimizing transitions and definitely giving ample warnings. A timer can be really useful for children with ASD, again, thinking about their visual processing. So if you can find a timer that shows visually, whether it's a sand timer or they have all sorts of fancy timers that show the time going down, that can be really helpful for children. Other environmental supports might include practicing appropriate nonverbal behaviors, such as eye contact, gestures, proximity to others, even correct posture. So we can be talking about practicing those. That's part of that social environment, and we want children to have a chance to practice those. Same thing with providing instruction on reading the nonverbal communications of others, facial expressions, body language, and again, practicing social interaction, saying hello or thank you. These are all ways to encourage the child to participate in the social environment, the social sphere of the classroom. And the last couple types of environmental supports you might want to include or think about. If a child is really obsessive with a particular topic, so we see this especially with children with Asperger's, if they just really have something that they can't stop talking about and can't stop thinking about all day long, you might want to teach the child that their discussion of that special topic is going to be restricted to a specific time or a specific place. That way you can kind of teach the child that that's okay for a certain time, but other times of the day we're going to do these things in the classroom together. And for older children, creating a buddy system with a peer, with a friend, or someone else in the classroom they have a good connection with can be really helpful. This can help the child with understanding things from the classroom, understanding instructions, staying on task, homework, all of those kinds of things. The last thing that I would like to leave you with today, there's a website here at the bottom that I would like for you to visit when you have the opportunity. And this here we're going to talk a little bit about the physical aspect of the environment a little bit more. So there's a list that's been created of some design standards for early childhood classrooms, especially those that include children with autism. Again, all of these practices are excellent practices for all children in all early childhood classroom, but especially those with autism. So when we're thinking about positive aspects to include in classroom design, we're thinking about flexibility and adaptability. And that doesn't necessarily mean that things are always changing, but what it means is that the environment can be transformed on a moment's notice. So that might include things like movable furniture, right? If we've discovered that a child really can't handle a certain way, a certain flow of the classroom movement where it's set up, we want to be able to be flexible to that and adaptable to that. We want our classrooms to be non-threatening, so they should be welcoming, encouraging encounters and community within the classroom. How is seating set up within the classroom? How are children encouraged to interact with other children? We want it to be non-distracting. This includes all sorts of distractions. This includes visual distractions. Are there too many bright things on the walls everywhere? This includes sounds. Even things like fans and air conditioners, things we might not normally notice. And this can even include smells. Smells can be very distracting for the child with ASD, so we want to try to minimize those as much as possible. Again, we want things to be predictable. We want things to be controllable for the child. So we're not necessarily talking that the child is controlling the environment, but when a child can understand his environment, his emotional security rises and the child feels an increased sense of control. So the child has his own personal space and he feels in control of himself and the way he functions in his environment. Sensory motor attuned, so that has to do with all of our senses. Safe, obviously physical, emotional, That reduces the need for rules and non-institutional. By that it means it feels like home. It feels safe for the child. All of these elements are so important.